Okay, hello everyone. You can hear me? Yes. Okay, excellent. So I'm Priya Nayar. I'm the Executive Director of University Alliance Ruhr. We are an alliance of 3 German universities: Ruhr University Bochum, TU Dortmund University, and University of Duisburg-Essen. I'm delighted that so many of you could join us this evening in person and online. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Consul Yasemin Pamuk. Yasemin is the outgoing consul, head of cultural affairs and science at the German Consulate General New York. She has kindly agreed to serve as a facilitator and moderator for tonight. She brings her own experience in political science and strategy to the table, as well as her interest in German history and its relevance in understanding transatlantic relations today. So, please welcome Consul Pamuk.
Thank you. Hello and welcome, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to welcome you tonight to the Roosevelt House, to the discussion Otto John, Patriot or Traitor. This event is co-presented by the University Alliance Ruhr, the German Consulate General New York, in cooperation with the Hunter College Department of German. And we are very happy to be in this beautiful historic venue, the Roosevelt House, and also to partner with the Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. So thank you for hosting us. The reason why we are here tonight is the German publication Otto John, Patriot oder Verräter, eine deutsche Biografie, authored by Michael Wala, who's on my right, and Benjamin Hett. Michael Wala is professor of North American history at the Ruhr University Bochum. His research, teachings, and publications focus on various aspects of North American history, and in particular on the history of intelligence services, which I found very intriguing. I know not a lot about it, but I'm curious about learning a lot tonight. His upcoming book, Spy versus Spy, West German Counterintelligence and the GDR Espionage, will be published in 2023. Benjamin Hett is professor of history at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Ben has authored several books on German history, such as The Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin and the Road to War, The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic, and Crossing Hitler, the man who put the Nazis on the witness stand. Ben is not new to this place and has spoken at several events and facilitated a number of events here at Roosevelt House. I'm very delighted that you are here tonight with us. Welcome. Before we turn to tonight's topic, let me just put this on the table. This publication is a product of a joint transatlantic summer workshop organized by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and Ruhr University Bochum in 2019. Who of you two had the idea to write this book, and what were your motives for taking on this dazzling figure of Otto John? Who would like to start?
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Actually, we both had the idea to write a book about Otto John, and then we realized that we both had an idea about writing a book about Otto John. So we decided it's a good idea to get together and write the book together, and that's what we did.
I actually, to this day, don't remember if it was initially Michael or me, but somehow it happened in connection with the workshop that we were doing collaboratively.
Yes, I mean, this cooperation seems to be a picture book example of transatlantic academic exchange. So in your view, what is the added value of a German and an American historian and expert working on this together? So what do you think? What did you bring to the table specifically?
Well, we have, as you indicated in your kind introduction, Michael and I have sort of different areas of specialty, which actually were really relevant to this project, because this is about an intelligence officer who got in trouble and was put on trial and convicted of treason. Michael has a lot of expertise in the history of intelligence. Among other things, he and our mutual friend, Konstantin Goslar, wrote a book a few years ago on the history of the entity that Otto John was the boss of, Germany's Domestic Intelligence Service, the BFV. As some of you will know, I am a recovering lawyer. In my wild, crazy, misspent youth, I was a corporate litigator, and I've been trying to get over that ever since. But some of the law sticks to you, and when I became a historian of Germany, I actually started off writing about German law and German lawyers. I couldn't actually, I feel like Michael Corleone, right? You try to get out and they pull you back in. So these expertise areas that Michael and I have, I think really went together very well on this particular project.
Michael, our protagonist, Otto John, was at the center of one of Germany's, I would say, biggest scandals in its post-war history. In reporting on his death, for example, the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung wrote in 1997 that John's story was one of the most mysterious criminal cases of post-war history. What are the bare facts?
Well, the bare facts is that Otto John, who became the president of the internal German intelligence institution, disappeared on the 20th of July, 1954, 10 years after the failed assassination of Hitler. And he ended up in East Berlin. And for a long time, people did not know why he actually went there, if he was abducted, if he went on his own free will, why he stayed for almost 1.5 years, and why he seemed to be a spokesperson of GDR propaganda during that time, because he was not a person who actually, excuse me, not a person who actually was friends with socialism or communism. He was opposed to all kinds of isms, actually. So why did he end up there? How did he end up there? And there were all kinds of different stories being told by different protagonists in this thing, who had different ideas and had different takes on it. And not even that, had also an agenda to paint him in a certain light.
Yes. And the book, or the title of your book is titled, I mean, it narrows this why down to Patriot or Traitor. And is there a definite answer to this question? So have you answered the question? Is he a traitor or a patriot?
So I think we came to, the title isn't, or the subtitle isn't very nuanced. I think we came to a somewhat more nuanced conclusion. I think you can safely say Otto John was not a traitor. He was clearly not a very good intelligence professional. There's not much doubt about that. But he was an undeniably brave man whose heart was in the right place. He had been active in the anti-Hitler resistance, leading to the famous Valkyrie plot of today in 1944. He had managed to survive only because he worked for Lufthansa and was able to get on a plane and fly to Spain. But I think his courage was manifested in that experience. And he was really in his heart a Democrat who wanted to see a democratic Germany. And there is to this day mystery and controversy over what exactly happened to him, because his story was the Soviets kidnapped him from West Berlin and brought him to East Berlin. When he was charged with treason on his return to West Germany in late 1955, the prosecution argument was that he had gone voluntarily into East Berlin, and then once in East Berlin had said all kinds of untrue and sort of defamatory things about the West German government. We came to the conclusion that the reality is somewhere in between, that as far as we have been able to determine in our research, John went voluntarily into East Berlin. He was not kidnapped and dragged into East Berlin, but he meant to come back, and his reason for going to East Berlin was an effort to get basically dirt on people in the West German government who had bad Nazi pasts, who were his rivals in Bonn, in the West German capital. And he wanted to try and get them out of the West German government. He thought the Soviets could give him information. Once he was there, the Soviets sort of thought, my goodness, we've got the head of West German counterintelligence right here. And so they kept him. And there's certain, we can get into this, but there's certain bits of evidence that we think point to that. It's sort of putting together a jigsaw puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Actually, Otto John went there with a friend, Wohlgemuth, who was a KGB agent. And Otto John had thought he would meet diplomats, Soviet diplomats, but he never met any Soviet diplomats. He met KGB agents. And they wanted to convince him to work for the East, for the KGB, for the Soviet Union, for the GDR. And he declined doing that. And the story that we kind of substantiated, I think, in our research is that he went there, he talked to the people, realized that what they wanted to make him an agent and work for them, he declined. And then he had coffee, and they probably, most likely, put some sleeping pills into his coffee so that he slept for 24 hours. And after that, waking up, he realized that he was in the hands of the KGB. And because he had gone to East Berlin without telling anyone that he had gone, he had left all his papers, identity cards, everything in his hotel room. Nobody knew that he had gone. He realized that he had made a big, 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 big mistake. And he just couldn't go back. And they wouldn't let him go back. He had always, until the very end, two people who were actually guarding him and preventing him from going back to the West.
You talk about evidence, and I know in my research on tonight's topic that there are many reports. There was even a parliamentary investigative committee dealing with the question what the motives of John were and what he actually did there. There were, I think he gave interviews, several interviews, and even wrote a biography himself explaining why he went there. So why do you think, or what is the new fact in your research, and where did you go? I imagine you went to archives, dusty, how do you say, reading dusty books and documents. So where do you find these evidences, and how do you put together this new evidence that you're talking about?
So yeah, lots of dusty archives. You know, to a history nerd, that's the fun part, and what was particularly fun with this project is while we were working on it, the BFV, the service that Jon worked for, sort of year by year released a new tranche of documents to the German Federal Archives in Koblenz. So every time I went back to Koblenz, you know, several years working on this project, it would be like, oh my God, there's like new dirt here on Jon. Some of it was pretty interesting. And we looked at there are American CIA documents that are relevant. I'm actually friends with a guy who was a CIA officer involved with this case. There are British documents that are relevant. That we got little bits and pieces of Russian stuff. It's hard to get that. I feel there are three important little factoids that point to something. One, Michael referred to the fact that the night of July 20th, the night that Jon disappeared, he emptied his pockets of everything, sort of identifying documents and letters and stuff, except for one official ID card from his service. Now, what's interesting about this is that's exactly what the service told its people if you were going to go into the Eastern Zone. Clear your pockets of everything except this one ID card. That's what he did. So this looks like he knows he's going into the zone. Like he's not getting kidnapped by his communist buddy in West Berlin. Point number two, his buddy, this Dr. Volkemuth, who drove him into East Berlin, in the wee hours of July 21st, ran back to West Berlin clearly in a panic and kind of cleared out his medical practice and grabbed his girlfriend, who later became his fourth wife, and in a big flap ran back to East Berlin. So basically, clearly something had happened that Volkemuth didn't expect, right? So if he had actually kidnapped Jon, which was Jon's story, Volkemuth would not have been in that panic in the wee hours of July 21st. And last thing that I think is like this sort of key little snapshot, there is a former Russian KGB officer named Viktor Chernyavsky, who in the early 1990s gave a really interesting statement. This was a guy who had spent his career doing disinformation, something that Russian intelligence is to this day famous for. And he gave this interesting statement in which he said, you know, my life has been lies. I've had it up to here with lies. I'm going to tell the truth. The truth is that, you know, you, Jon, you came to us, and you know, as Michael said, they couldn't agree on what they were going to do. So we knocked you out with drugs, and then we sort of psychologically intimidated you into staying. And the fact that he said that in the way that he said it, and that his story doesn't look good on the KGB, to me has the real ring of truth. So I think that's where you get the sort of solution to the mystery. I think, you know, any solution to the mystery has to be consistent with those facts.
Absolutely. If I may add on to that, Ben just mentioned that Otto John's story was that he was abducted. clearly knowing that he wasn't abducted to go to East Berlin. He must have known that because we also had found evidence that the Border Patrol, for example, knew that two people in that particular car had gone there, one in the driver's seat and one next to the driver, and both looked wide awake, talking to each other. And that was Wohlgemuth and Otto John. That Otto John actually invented the story that he had been abducted by Wohlgemuth was a cover story to help him prevent being charged with treason.
Which he was later, but we will come to that back.
Right. So that was, and that made it all so complicated because he didn't tell the truth. He didn't tell what was actually happening at the time. And that made it very, very complicated because that was kind of a place where people could slide in different kinds of stories about what happened, that he had been on a bar, going through bars, being drunk, being into homosexual bars at the time before going to East Berlin and stuff like that. All that what never happened, but it was possible because Otto John had invented the story of his abduction.
Coming to the trial, I would like to quote the then chief federal prosecutor, Max Güde, who in his plea at the end of the proceedings attested to John's modest intelligence, quote, mental dwarvism and total insignificance, and went on saying, it's a longer quote now, the defendant is not a traitor at all, but a weakling, not a criminal, but even less a failure. He will be civically death, a nothing. Of the dead of July 20, who gave their lives for Germany and whose commitment was accepted, I say incessantly, what an honor to belong to the hanged and not to the executioners. Perhaps I'm foolish when I say that the survivors of such an enterprise should not boast of the deed. The honor of such a most desperate deed belongs only to the dead. The survivors, if they boast of the deed as a merit, devalue the rank of an extremely moral risk, which the dead have paid with their lives. So what seems to me most remarkable is, besides the content of this and the connection with July 20, 1944, the utter contempt that sounds from these words. Michael, what was Otto John's real guilt here? So what is he really tried for?
I think it's more complicated. Güde actually thought that John should not be prosecuted. And he said, well, we shouldn't have this trial. It's not worth having the trial. He's not a traitor. What he did is not something that we should prosecute. But I know that the court will try to sentence him to a very long time in prison. So I cannot ask the court to dismiss the case. I will ask the court to, let's say, 2 years. The court actually sentenced him to 4 years imprisonment. And to make this argument stronger, he portrayed Otto John as someone who is not a strong person, who could never have been a traitor. He is a weakling. That is part of an argument that Güde actually used. But then again, it's also a take on Otto John's physique, on his manners, because he didn't come across as a strong person. He came across as someone who was refined, cultured. He was good looking. He always dressed very, very well. And that put him in a kind of slot of possibly being someone who is homosexual, is weak, is not a strong person who could have stood up to his captors. And then again, also Otto John was married to a wife that was years older than he was. And she came across in court as a very strong person. And that even made him weaker.
I understand. Okay. Well, so you're saying in principle that Güde used this as a tactical argument and didn't mean it really? Is that what lawyers do, or prosecutors? I mean,
yes, actually, yeah. I mean, everything Michael said is I exactly agree. In my crazy young lawyer days, my mentor used to say to me, you go into court to persuade. You're there to persuade the judge, the jury, whatever it may be. Anything that's not persuading them, you're not doing your job. So, I mean, that's exactly it. Guda's argument, it sounds really nasty, but it's like mostly tactical because it's important to keep in mind the judges in this court, it's West Germany 1956. The judges are all Nazis. Like the West German judiciary of that era was overwhelmingly ex-Nazis, and often not just nominal, like some really pretty nasty ex-Nazis were in the judiciary. This court is actually literally drooling to like send Johan away for as long as they can. Johan's defense attorney said the presiding judge literally drooled when he yelled, like spit flying from his mouth when he yelled at Johan. These are Nazis who hate this guy from the resistance, right? So the prosecutor, who's actually relatively sympathetic to Johan, wants him to get the best outcome he's gonna get from these guys. So that's why he argues it that way, is to persuade. And I just wanna touch on the other point too, that you are hearing, there is an authentic note in what Prosecutor Guda was saying. It's the authentic note of the discomfort of so many people in West German society in that era, in the face of someone like Johan, who had been in the tiny minority, who risked their lives to get rid of Hitler. For most people keep their head down most of the time, right? Most of us would do that if we were in that situation. But then it's embarrassing afterwards, after all the horrors of Nazism, to be confronted with this guy who did take the risks that you didn't take. So there's enormous resentment. The few survivors of the July 20 attack were basically reviled as traitors in West Germany for years after the war. There are opinion polls that show this. So it's not like, oh, you had the courage to fight the Nazis. No, it's like, you're making me look bad, so I'm gonna resent you. That's the attitude, and that comes through loud and clear in the trial. And Johan was really, and to your question of what was he really being tried for, in a way, he was really being tried for being in the resistance against Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one more
Yes, of
point.
course, please.
The really mean part in this argument is, and Ben alluded to that, is that you're only a good resistance fighter if you are a dead resistance fighter. If you survived, you weren't really a good resistance fighter. And Fritz Kolbe, one of the other resistance fighters, actually said that in a book that he wrote. Only a dead resistance fighter is being honored as being a resistance fighter. And that was actually a take in the Foreign Office for a very long time. People who had been in the resistance and had survived weren't really honored. You have plaques and stuff like of people who were in between somewhat, but those who had survived, like Otto John, weren't really honored at the time.
Mm-hmm. I would like to go deeper into this question from two angles. One, the individual psychological angle, Otto John, and on the other side, the systemic angle. So looking at the systemic or the structural angle, this trial and also the mentioning of the resistance and the July 20, 1944 events, John's actions, what did it mean for the young, evolving, maybe not yet democratic, obviously with, continuity in Nazi personalities. What did it mean for the young German, West German Republic?
Go ahead. So there's a great term, it's a little hard to translate, but I'll throw it out anyway. There's a great term that people use when they talk about the West German government of the 1950s under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. In German you say Demokratur, which is a sort of fusion of the two words that mean democracy and dictatorship in German. So you're suggesting in your question, it would be unrealistic to expect a country that had been 12 years under the rule of the Nazis and then 4 years under occupation to sort of turn on a dime and suddenly become a full-blown democracy. I mean, God knows, in the year 2022, I don't probably need to tell a room full of Americans that, after 200 plus years, democracy is an imperfect project in this country, right? So, you're not gonna get like full-on democracy in Germany in 1949 or 1950 or 1956. It takes time. And one of the things that I think is, or we think is fascinating about the Otto John case is it sort of shows this playing out. It shows a kind of awkward sort of birth pains of democracy. And it shows a country for which there is real contention among surviving parties from the Nazi era. We see this in all kinds of states, the transition out of authoritarian pasts, and this is the West German version. the ex-Nazis and the ex-resistance people are there. And they haven't really changed their minds much. And they're fighting for control of the West German state in the 50s. And John was really a player. He was not a very competent player, but he was very much a player in that sort of contestation for the future of the West German state. And he's very much consciously fighting it out with the surviving, ex-Nazis and so on that he's competing with for power in Bonn.
But the whole difference is that not too many resistance fighters survived, but very, very many former members of the NSDAP, they may not even all have been really hardcore Nazis, but they survived, and they have gotten their jobs back in the departments, and they were gatekeepers. They were actually gatekeepers to kind of keep people out. Otto John had actually applied for a job in the Foreign Office, and one of the gatekeepers there, Melchers, put his application at the bottom of the file on purpose. And he was later on asked why he did do that. No, he didn't do anything wrong. It was, something that just happened and stuff like that. But he praised himself later on, and we can see it from documents in the Politisches Archiv of the Foreign Office in Germany, which, one of the archives that we searched, that he actually did this on purpose, that he actually tried to keep people out of the foreign service who had been in the resistance and who had fought the Nazis. Because the Foreign Office, as many of you will know, had created this myth, and Melchers was one of them who actually created it, that the Foreign Office was it's not hotbed, term is missing here, was an important part of the resistance. Very, very many people in the Foreign Office supposedly were against the Nazis and prevented the very worst. But then again, the majority of people in the Foreign Office played their part and didn't prevent very much. And one of the people who were put in the forefront of this supposed resistance part in the Foreign Office was von Weizsäcker, who actually was never that. And they tried to kind of prolong this myth and try to keep people out.
We are waiting for your next book on the Foreign Office, probably this year. No, but I would like to dig deeper in this historical context. This was 1954, 55, was also a time of major decisions for Germany to make. Adenauer did the West integration. Germany became a member of the NATO in 1955. And John, obviously, while being in East Berlin, also said that, or claimed that Germany should remain neutral, and that a West integration, particularly a remilitarization of Germany, would mean that not only reunification would be at stake, but also generally this would not create or be conducive for a peaceful Europe. So what do you think? Did Germany become, or did this West integration happen despite or because of the case John? Or didn't it play a matter at all?
I don't think it played such a big role in that. I'm not sure if Ben would answer that differently. The conclusion by most of the public and by the court was done before Otto John was actually convicted. And we have a different time here. Otto John was very anti-militaristic. He was born in 1909, and when he was a young boy, during the First World War, his uncle, who was a pharmacist, took him to one of the trains where the wounded from the Western Front were shipped back to the hospitals back in Germany. And that made a huge impression on him. He was always against any kind of military. And all of a sudden, he was in a situation where his future as a lawyer was taking part in a very militaristic country, Nazi Germany. And that spills over into his fear of having a new German army, and a new German army as a threat to a young democracy, which was not very stable at the time. If you look at public opinion polls, for example, it's amazing what people think. People in 1952, 1954 think that one strong person should be at the helm of the state. Well, Adenauer was there, the Kanzlerdiktatur. And 25%, if I remember correctly, actually mentioned that well, the Jews, they were responsible also for what happened to them and all that. You have this old thinking in Western Germany in 1952, 1954, and then having an army again was for John a big threat to the future of a democratic federal republic.
What is your take, Ben?
Yeah, I agree, of course. If you sort of look really carefully at the timeline, there are interesting things happening at the same time. I mean, I think West Germany's integration into NATO and ultimately into what today is the European Union, I think those things would have happened one way or another, Yon or no Yon, but it didn't necessarily look that way at the time. One thing that's really interesting is that the first effort to get West German armed forces into some kind of military alliance with Western European countries was a project called the European Defense Community, the EDC, which was being talked about in the early 50s. And what's kind of interesting is that the EDC ultimately failed because the French Parliament refused to ratify it. The French Parliament voted it down, and it had to be accepted by all the potential member countries. And that vote happened, I think, 2 weeks or so after Jon's disappearance. And these things were seen at the time as sort of part of a pattern. Jon's disappearance certainly wasn't helping Adenauer's project of trying to sort of lead West Germany into these international networks. And Jon, I think quite sincerely, some of what he said in East Germany about opposing NATO, about being in favor of unification, German reunification, I think he did sincerely believe. He certainly was not a communist. But some of what the Eastern Bloc message was in the Cold War were things he agreed with. And he was not alone in that. There was a substantial block of West German opinion that wanted a Germany that was reunified and neutral and not militarized, exactly for the reasons Michael said. I mean, you can't, if you're a thoughtful German and it's 1953 or so, you can see why you wouldn't want an army, right? So it's kind of, there was a political movement at the time, which I love the name of, a political movement against having a West German army. It was called Ohne mich, like without me, or sort of count me out. Like, I'm not doing this again. Like 2 world wars were enough. So that's part of the environment in which Chancellor Adenauer and his quite conservative government, with support of a lot of ex-Nazis, was sort of navigating towards getting a West German army, getting West Germany into NATO and stuff like that. But it was a very difficult kind of navigation that had to happen there.
Right, and Otto John's arguments for unification and demilitarization are not having was a thorn in that project.
Yes, I understand. Thank you. Coming to, let's flip the coin and come to the psychological individual part. So you said already Otto John was a very well-built, considered attractive, considered man. He obviously had a gewisse Eitelkeit, so so as I understand it. And he also took care very much of his appearances, and yes, so I would say also. What is interesting in looking at what he said and how he acted, it seems that there is a lot of frustration. So in the end, he failed almost everything in his life. So he failed to become the real resistance guy, that is to die in the process or to be successful in the process. He failed to act as a president of the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz to protect the constitution, because he was faced with many ex-Nazis. And in the end, he also failed with whatever he intended to do with his act, if you want so. So is he a failed existence in the end? Sorry to be
no. It's hard to kind of judge Otto John. He wrote a lot of letters to his wife when he was in East Germany and when he was in Russia too.
I don't know if he wrote letters to Russia.
No, but in East Germany, right? They're in the Imperial War Museum. Ben looked at all that stuff. It's not easy to read, and there's a lot of frustration, a lot of hope in there. And he is, for the rest of his life, fighting to be exonerated.
And he failed there too. Right?
And he failed there too. In a sense, I think at the end of his life, he must have thought that I failed very, very many things. On a personal note, I mean, it's not only political, but, did you have a good relationship with your partner? Didn't you have that? Did you have friends who stood by you? Did you stay by your friends? I don't think he failed in that respect. One thing, if I may, he was, looking for his appearance, being a little bit eitel, as we say in Germany. When he fled on July 24, 1944, to Madrid on that Lufthansa plane that you mentioned, he took a suitcase with him, and that contained his smoking. And that actually gave him away, because he went to Madrid and contacted the British embassy, and they hid him someplace until they found out that the Gestapo office in Spain were looking for him and were about to find him. Then they shipped him clandestinely to Portugal, where they hid him again amongst communists. And there was a raid by the international police, and Otto John was questioned, and he said, well, I'm a downed British pilot. And they opened his suitcase, and there was his smoking with, the name tag Office Berlin Taylor.
I understand. So, I mean, you involved yourself many years, I suppose, in researching Otto John and finding out his true story. So someone doing this probably gets a very personal relationship with him, in a sense. Have you ever met him personally? And
No.
do you feel pity for him? Is there any emotion that develops in this endeavor that you did?
So he died in 1997. He spent literally the second half of his life, from when he got out of prison in 1958 to his death in 1997, trying to overturn his treason conviction. 5 different times. There's a procedure in German law to do this, to reopen and get a retrial. He tried 5 different times and failed 5 times. In a way, my entry to this story was that I was very good friends with his last lawyer, a very good Berlin defense attorney named Gerhard Jungfer, who I was dear friends with. Gerhard died about 5 years ago, to my great sadness. And we got to be friends from other things. One day, about maybe 12, 13 years ago, I was having lunch with Gerhard, or dinner with Gerhard in Berlin, and somehow Otto John came up, and Gerhard said, he was my client. And I just about fell off my chair. And Gerhard said, I got all these documents. You want to come to my office and see them? And he would say that to a historian, and the answer is going to be yes. And that's sort of how I got into the story. But, there are 2 things. It's difficult for me to think of Otto John as a failure. I mean, in some sense he was. It's true. He probably would have said he didn't succeed at most things he wanted. But, in a difficult time, he was a brave and honorable man, and that counts for something. There's a real element of tragedy to the last years of his life. I mean, he said over and over again, I don't want to die a traitor. And technically speaking, he did, because he never got that conviction overturned. And even after he died, my friend Gerhard told me he could have kept the case going and maybe cleared Otto John's name. The family didn't want to pay the legal bills, and Gerhard said he would have been so angry that the family wouldn't pay the bills, like to keep the case going. So Gerhard wasn't happy about it either. Just very quickly, I want to say, whatever the rights and wrongs of what he did, his legal conviction was ridiculous. I mean, what he did not even come close to fitting what German law sort of specifically sets out as the sort of gravamen of the offenses with which he was charged and convicted. So those 5 efforts to get a retrial should have succeeded. I mean, the first one should have succeeded. Well, he shouldn't have been convicted. And then the first one should have succeeded. As Michael said earlier, he made his own life more difficult than it needed to be by telling such a stupid story. And even at his trial, his defense attorney and the prosecutor, Max Gude, were saying to him, basically, look, we get that you're not a traitor. We get you weren't trying to betray the country. This bit about being abducted from West Berlin, that's clearly ridiculous. Just tell the truth, that you went voluntarily and they kept you, and you'll be fine. And John wouldn't do that. That's the one thing he wouldn't do. And if he had, it would have been really hard for the court to convict him, because the conviction was legally ludicrous in any case. And that's part of the tragedy of this whole thing.
I hear a lot of empathy in this. So no,
Fair
really,
enough.
it's close. I would like to explore a last topic before we come to the Q&A session. That is the role of secret services. And the former KGB officer Viktor Chernyavsky claimed in an interview that John was a victim of German history in a way. You write in your book that John mainly became a plaything, do you say that in that way, of Eastern secret services. So what exactly was it? And to what extent do we have an involvement of German or American secret services here? So is this a game, an agent thriller? Or how should we think of it?
I think that's you.
That's me. Yeah, as we mentioned before, the KGB kind of abducted him. They put sleeping pills into his coffee and tried to play him. They shipped him to Moscow, interrogated him, and we actually have some transcriptions of these interrogations from the Russian. And we can actually see that John gave away some information during these interrogations. And that was part of what was agreed upon in his service, that you have to play along and try to find a way to escape again. But you have to play along in a certain way and don't give away any important information. What he did was he gave away information about his attempts to find former Nazis. Because that was at his heart. I mean, he conducted a clandestine intelligence operation apart from his department, which was totally wrong. You should never do that. And then he was taken back to the GDR, and he was played there. He was not interrogated, but he was used as a propaganda machine for what they wanted to do. He couldn't go away. Markus Wolf, one of the very famous, as you know, chiefs of foreign intelligence of the GDR, wrote a couple of books, 2 books, one in English, one in German, about his time as chief of HVA, and he tells different stories in these 2 books. The English version is very different when it comes to Otto John from the German version. And you find that very often, that KGB agents, GDR intelligence officers tell different stories. MI5, to my knowledge, was not heavily involved. And the CIA was not heavily involved in that case. They didn't do much on it. They let it play out, basically. But Ben may want to add on that CIA file.
Yeah, they weren't heavily involved, but they were heavily informed. They were very aware of what was happening. Johan had visited Washington just a few months before he disappeared. Right. And he had met CIA people in Washington. He had met FBI. He met Herbert Hoover. He met J. Edgar Hoover in Washington. Didn't get along with him well at all. Was treated quite rudely by Hoover, who thought he was a communist. Not a rare distinction, I think. But
homosexual.
And a homosexual, yeah. So the CIA were really aware of the story. They were following it very closely. They had their own sources of information on it. Interestingly, by the way, to this day, try applying to see the CIA's apparently copious file on Otto John, and what will happen is they will tell you, no, it's classified national security. We're talking about something from the 50s. They're still holding on to it. Fortunately, I knew people who had been in the CIA at that time. One friend who I interviewed for our book, I told him I couldn't get, I applied to get the CIA file, been turned down. I appealed, it was turned down. I told my friend this, and he said, oh, well, I'll tell you what's in the file. so he did. So we sort of got the information. Also, funnily enough, the CIA had a file on Otto John's wife, which they released. And there's a lot in that file about what they think about Otto John. So I think in this sense we benefit a little bit from CIA stupidity. But there's one other thing I was going to say, but now I forgot what it was. So I guess maybe I'll just be quiet.
Maybe I could adapt. Sure. Add on that. What the CIA and the Americans were very much aware of was that Otto John and some other resistance fighters and people who had been close to the resistance didn't want the Federal Republic too close to the Americans and too close to the British. This idea about a neutral state and a unified Germany, and that was actually Otto John's project, and he really, really had his heart in that. that did not kind of tally with what the American political system and the idea of the State Department and presidency wanted at the time. So he was not perceived as a real threat, but as someone who should rather be quiet. We have someone else, former ambassador to the United States, Friedrich von Prittwitz und Gaffron, who is the only high diplomat, only ambassador to resign in 1933. And he also was for a reunified and neutral Germany. And we found in the files that the Americans said, well, make him shut up.
Yes, because they wanted the West integration, of course.
Absolutely.
Yes, and at the price of, probably at the price of reunification. We don't know what the files are, but we know that the CIA was heavily involved in the forming of the so-called Gehlen-Organisation. And we talked about the two German, secret services, Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz and Gehlen, which later became the BND, and that there was a heavy, also, concurrence, if not, say, deadly concurrence between the two institutions. So, if I understand correctly, the Americans built the BND. Were they against the Bundesverfassungsschutz, or how was it? How is the structure here between the two secret services and if you look at American involvement?
So no, the Americans were not against the BFE. They had to approve it. The four occupying powers all had to sort of sign off on it, and they all had to sign off on who the leading personnel were going to be, like Jon. Since in a way, almost everything in the West German government in the late 40s and early 50s was in some way a kind of Allied creation, or at least the Allies had oversight over it. I think the thing here is the Americans didn't fully grasp, what Gehlen was really up to with his organization. They had sort of loose oversight over it, but he had his own agenda very much. And he was pursuing his own agenda, which I think the Americans only sort of partially grasped. So I think, if they had known the sort of full nature of the rivalry between Gehlen and Jon and between the organizations, I would be willing to bet the Americans would have sided more with Gehlen, but I think there were limits to what they knew. The other thing I was going to say earlier, just make a point quickly, intelligence is a very ruthless activity, and so one of the things that, on the point of Jon being a sort of plaything of other intelligence services, the KGB used him really, really ruthlessly because the KGB had several other deep penetration agents in West German services from which they were getting almost all the information that they could have got from Jon. But they used Jon. The KGB could sort of imply, when they started arresting people in East Germany or in Russia, they could sort of imply that this information had come from Jon, which allowed them to kind of cover the people that they had penetrating the other West German services.
Yeah. If I may add on to the difference between the Organisation Gehlen and the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz internal intelligence organization is that the Organisation Gehlen was financed by the Americans until 1952. But still, as Ben said, they hardly knew what they were doing. Gehlen never gave away the names of the agents that the Americans were paying at the time. And for the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, Otto John's outfit, every person who applied for a job was screened by the British, the French, and the Americans. And you have thousands of applications, actually, and you have lists where the American, British, and French actually check this person can be hired or can't be hired. And it actually goes down to the janitor. I mean, they actually find what information. The Counterintelligence Corps, US Army, for example, has 1.7 million files on individuals in Germany. So they screened these people very thoroughly. That means that former Gestapo members are very rare in the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, but they abound in the Gehlen organization.
Yes, that sets a whole different culture, organizational culture, of course. Thank you. I'm sure that there are many, many other things that we could explore, but I would like to give the audience the chance to ask questions, and I see already hands raising, very good. So let me start. I think this lady, there, and there, please. Do we have a microphone? Sorry. Oh, there is one. Okay, great. Thank you.
At the beginning, I thought, how naive can this man really be? And thoughts of the Manchurian Candidate ran through my head, along with the stories that were written by Jean Le Carré, Ian Fleming, Graham Greene, who all had intelligence backgrounds to an extent that we're not even aware of. However, after the end, which I enjoyed immensely, I learned so much. I think he was just a scapegoat. He was needed for the old Nazis in the new West German regime to justify themselves, to make it a show trial of sorts. The fact that he was wrongly convicted and tried to overturn what happened to him all those years shows that the Nazis were still in power and they weren't going to give up no matter what.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Please.
It could be just a simple question, but when he fled to East Berlin in 1954, and then after a few months he fled back to West Germany, and wasn't he afraid because he was a member of this German anti-fascists? They organized the assassination of Hitler, and 10 years before he was going to be caught by the Gestapo. How could he do that? I mean, how, and then to go to East Berlin and then fleeing back to West Germany, and I couldn't, I mean.
Are you saying that he might have or should have been afraid of going back to the West? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think 1955 he went back to West
Right.
Germany.
Actually, no, he wasn't scared at all because he was convinced that he would not be put on trial, because that was the information he had received at the time. He was very much surprised when he was actually arrested, because he thought that it's okay, I can go back, no problem, and I won't be arrested. That was the information that he received, not officially, but unofficially from the Justice Department people.
Yeah, he had sort of a back channel. While he was in the East, he had a kind of back channel communication to the West German government. And they were telling him, it's okay, come home. So, I mean, he got shafted. I mean, he got totally royally shafted, basically. And he did come back thinking everything would be fine, and then it wasn't fine. You know, I don't think anyone ever thought he was in danger for his life in West Germany, but he was certainly, as we know, in danger of a potentially long prison sentence.
The gentleman over there, yes? Can we have a microphone, please? The second gentleman, yes.
If I'm correct, I think you said that an excuse for going to East Berlin was that he wanted to find some dirt on some of the ministers or government officials in West Berlin, that they might be to hold over them when he returned. But I was wondering if he knew, like you mentioned, there were several judges who had Nazi pasts, and maybe even a lot of people didn't have he could have done everything there in West Germany to find some dirt, just like the Klarsfelds did. They dedicated their lives to Holland people who had terrible deeds during the war.
Well, the thing about that is a very large share of the crimes that Nazis had committed had been in Eastern Europe. So a lot of the evidence was in the hands of the Russians or the Poles or people like that, governments like that. And very particularly the Russian intelligence services. So Yon thought they might have information that I can't get in the West. I wouldn't say that was his excuse for going, that was his reason. I mean, his excuse was he got kidnapped. I mean, he never admitted that he went voluntarily at all. We think his reason was to get information that the Russians would have had on his rivals in West Germany, and it's because they had been where the crimes were, basically.
Like to add something? No. Then I have a question of Jan Lüdert here, please. Can we have a microphone there?
Thank you so much. While I'm very curious about the substantive content of your work, I'm wondering about the methodological approach that you both took, and perhaps you could also speak to the opening up of archives, digitization, and the way that this work was impacted by the way that you are able to access data in new ways or in surprising ways, and also the way that the collaboration works. I think as an author, we're all interested in how that works. It's a long process, and we have to be resilient and keep each other going. So I'd be really curious to hear more about your methods and the archival aspects of the work and the collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you for the great question. So.
Archival sources, Yasemin mentioned that a colleague of mine and I did a book before that, Keine neue Gestapo, No New Gestapo. And that helped opening up a lot of archival material from the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, the internal intelligence service. Also the British files, the KV files in Kew in London, National Archive, they successively open up new files. We could, for example, find files on Otto John and find a file that Otto John applied for citizenship in Great Britain. And he had support for that. He changed his mind, and because his connection with former resistance fighters in Germany, who told him to come back and help to build a better, democratic Germany. And that was actually what he wanted to do in different kinds of ways, applying to the Foreign Office, trying again to get a job in the Lufthansa as a lawyer, because that's what he knew to do. He was never a person to run a big department. The Bundesamt had 700, 800 people, and he was not a good administrator. You know, he was out of his depth at that time. So new archival material opening up. We shared archives. We used a way where you could put stuff in the cloud, and both of us could see the documents that Ben had collected, and I had collected different documents, so we kind of meshed these things together. And when it came to writing, we kind of had intense discussions about different chapters. Obviously, the former lawyer did the most part on the trial system, because that's what he wanted to do in the first place. And I did a lot of stuff on the intelligence part when Otto John is going to Madrid and then ending up in Great Britain, working there for propaganda services against Nazi Germany. So that worked out fine. And when it comes to archives, Ben mentioned that, you know, you apply and you apply again. National Archives, once I waited 4 years, or I had to wait 4 years until finally the stuff was cleared. And 4 weeks ago, I got material from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, that I had asked for 3.5 years ago.
But
so
not on
it had to do with something else, but I mean, you have to be patient, and you have to stay healthy, and live a very long life to get the stuff that you need to write your books and your articles.
I got the FBI file on him too. I think that took 2 years, 3 years, something like that. In terms of working together, you know, I think I had the advantage here that Michael is just an extremely nice guy. I'm a jerk, so he had to deal.
Yes.
He's the one who had
That's
to deal
true.
with a jerk.
That's true.
I got to deal with, you know, a nice guy. But I think our collaboration, I think, was utterly smooth, as far as I can tell. I mean, I can't imagine a better co-author, actually, than Michael. I think there are probably many pitfalls in writing a book with someone else that you could have, but we didn't.
Worked out fine.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So one last question. You said already that not all files are open and clear, open to the public and cleared. So when is Otto John, Patriot oder Vertreter Teil 2, part 2, to be expected? When they are open, then, what would you say? How many years do you have to live and wait for the next files?
How long is Putin going to be there?
Well, and probably after we have a translated publication in the United States of our book.
Yes, you are playing in my hand. We did this, of course, because we hope that this wonderful book, who's only accessible in German at the moment, will be translated into English, and I hope that there are many publishers here who now run to either the authors or my colleague and wonderful partner Priya Nayar and ask for the rights to publish it in English. So thank you for your great great questions.
You mentioned a suitcase that they opened when he got to Portugal. And did you use the word, I didn't understand it, but was it smoking?
Like a tuxedo.
A tuxedo, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, a tuxedo.
Smoking's the German word.
So, thank you again for coming here, and thanks to our hosts, the Roosevelt House, and now I give back to Priya.
Very short thank you to say. I have to thank from the bottom of my heart to Michael and Ben for your thoughtful conversations this evening. Yasemin, thank you for serving as our guide as we navigated through this complex history. And I would like to thank our partners, Hunter College President Jennifer Raab, Roosevelt House for their excellent cooperation. So thank you, Harold Holzer and Mac Barrett. Mac is right here. I hope that this is a beginning of many more joint projects. Thank you, Kira, for your background work in research. And our conversation from today in the context of history, identity, and the space of transatlantic relations is super vital. So I'm looking forward to inviting everybody to join us for a reception and continuing these conversations upstairs. So thank you.